Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Amy Bryant, and I'm a psychotherapist here in Atlanta, Georgia, with Wild Child Counseling, and I work with children, adolescents, and families. I also do online parent education and coaching through Parenting Beyond Punishment worldwide, and I'm really excited to be here today with Robbyn Bennett and Dr. Porges, and I want to thank you for being here today, too.
So it's really exciting to be here today. Have you ever wondered what exactly is happening in your body when you get triggered, and why it's so difficult to keep yourself from yelling or grabbing your child or even spanking them? And have you ever thought, like, if only my body could calm down, I could handle this situation a lot better? So I think we've all experienced that. And so the reason that we keep coming back to this issue of safety and being triggered is that it's because it's both your ability to feel safe and calm in relationship to your child and your ability to restore a sense of safety that really allows us to feel connected and allows us to be the parents that we really want to be. So today, it's so wonderful to have Dr. Porges here. He is the originator of the polyvagal theory, which is a very technical word. It's really about the autonomic system and what puts us into that state of arousal that we feel like we can't really manage. He is the distinguished university scientist at the Kinsey Institute and a research professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of North Carolina. He has been studying the stress response for over 40 years. He's been working on this theory of how our vagus nerve works, and his work has really, truly, completely transformed our understanding of how we cope with stress, and specifically how we can be with children and children also that have been traumatized. If you've heard about this idea of the fight or flight or freeze, this is all based on Dr. Porges' work. So you already have some idea of what we'll be talking about today. So I just want to open up the discussion and just begin with Dr. Porges. Could you just tell us a little bit about this technical word, polyvagal theory? Like, what is that?
Sure. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. And to the other point I really want to start off with, I am a father of 2 boys. So that already tells you some of the experiences I've had. And also I'm a grandfather now for the first time. So where I can see my grandchild through the eyes of having been a father and having learned much more about how our nervous system works. Perhaps one of the problems is that when most people have their children, or when most people become parents, they're still in a mindset that is very much like their children. They have, in a sense, been into this less evaluative, more observer mode that a grandparent can be in. So the beauty of, as I worked with my children, I used to say, a father can never be a good father, but that person could be a wonderful uncle and a great grandfather. It's because of the cultural expectation of males, or for males, to create boundaries for children without understanding the behavior, the physiology underneath it. So now to your question, I just wanted to say that I am, like many of the people on this webinar, a parent. And I've had experiences, and my children had their range of behaviors that went from wonderful to the other kind.
Yes.
Okay. And as a parent, I was always concerned. And I was also concerned about the structure of school systems and the social institutes that our children we try to enable our children to fit into. And sometimes they just don't fit that well. So how does that all relate to the work that I do, and where does it come from, and what is this polyvagal theory?
Yes.
The way of thinking about polyvagal theory is very similar to your preamble, your introduction. The curiosity that I've always had is what's going on underneath the skin. What is going on? It's not the thoughts, it's something else. So polyvagal theory is really my personal journey in understanding how physiological state at times hijacks our mind and our behavior, and other times makes us feel so comfortable that we are so welcoming and engaging that we can become personally intimate with other people. And other times our body says, wow, stay away. And, and the issue is our cognitions are not the driving force. There are other things going on in our body. So we're going to talk about two things here. One is the bottom-up features of physiological activity and what our nervous system makes of those. Then we'll talk about top-down, and we'll talk about this whole hierarchy. So whether we talk about fight or flight, or we talk about freeze, like you brought up earlier, we really have to reconceptualize them into a hierarchical model in which the controlling factor is a state of safety. And that state of safety enables certain neural structures to calm the fight-flight systems and to keep us out of dissociative, shutting down, collapse type systems. So if those on board or on the webinar have experience with trauma, they are totally intuitively understanding much more than most of the therapists and most of the scientists do. They know that there are two types of defense reactions they may have. One is to be aggressive and to protect themselves, to be mobilized, but the other one is to shut down and dissociate. And the vulnerability that has happened to so many people with histories of abuse is that no one witnessed them, no one listened to what they were saying. They were saying, I get so upset, so scared, that I disappear, I lose boundary, I dissociate, I just fall apart. And the physiological systems that drive that are very primitive. So now we're going to talk about what polyvagal theory really is. It emphasizes a hierarchy. And the hierarchy starts through an evolutionary model. Starts with the oldest vertebrates had a vagal system. And the vagus is a nerve that goes from the brainstem to the organs of your body. Now, the ancient vertebrates use this nerve to reduce to slow their heart rate, and if they had a great need for metabolic resources, meaning they had no food or the temperature changed, they would defecate. I want you to think for a moment about the children. When they get so scared, they immobilize, and many of them will defecate in their pants.
Yes.
And it's not a voluntary response. It is a reflex of immobilization with fear. And that is an ancient vertebrate response. You see this in turtles. You see this in other reptiles. When they are under threat, they will defecate because they stop breathing. And to enable their bodies to survive without breathing for long periods of time, they have to reduce the metabolic demands and food. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, with children, a lot of times I'm wondering if constipation is also a part of
We'll
this.
We'll get to that, or the cycle of diarrhea to constipation.
Yes.
And
yes.
okay, so when we get to this shutting down, we see diarrhea, and because that was the reptiles' actually a major defense system. But reptiles and other mammals have another defense system, which is mobilization. Mm-hmm. When you mobilize and you're constantly in this state, based upon a polyvagal theory, there's a hierarchy. So movement and aggressiveness keeps you out of shutting down. Now, what does that do to your gut? You become constipated.
Okay.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that now we can see that acting out the tantrum behavior, the aggressiveness, the frustration that's coming out is often neurophysiologically adaptive. It keeps the adult from shutting down.
So the what we would call the hyper behavior and the jumping around and not listening is actually adaptive.
It's adaptive
at some level.
At some level, but not in the social context.
Right. It's not great for us as parents.
It's right. But, so we want to get the child to that next level.
Yes.
The next level is this level, what we're calling when the body is feeling safe. But when the body is feeling safe, you see other things occurring. You see the neural regulation of the upper part of the face, the glowing eyes of the child,
yes.
the voice of the child. The child can now hear and listen to what you're saying without being distracted. Now, when that system's in play, there's a sense of presence with the child or with another adult, and there is reciprocity, meaning synchronous interaction with each other.
So the child is listening and talking to us, and they're hearing us, and
Yeah,
we feel like it's happening.
it's happening, right? That moment, the
Mm.
moment. And what that is doing, it's a neural exercise in which the inhibitory systems that contain fight and flight and protect us from shutting down, that system, they're contained, and now our entire autonomic nervous system works to support health, growth, restoration, and social behavior.
So that would be resiliency in the language of the trauma-informed community, is it allows for resiliency. I do want to say something too, maybe you could say more about safety, because when I started to share your ideas with my own clients that I work with, they would say, well, I feel safe, but I could tell from sitting with their bodies that actually they were very alarmed. So can you describe what you mean when you say safety? Because I think we're so cognitive and emotional, but we don't really understand the body very well.
That's right. So we get into, I use the term moral veneer. So we start to say what we want people, what we think people want us to say. I'm safe. But their posture, they'd be like, I'm safe. And their voice would not reflect safety. So when we talk about a neurophysiological state of safety, we're actually operationally defining it by the physiological features, which will be the orbital muscle around the eye works, the facial expressions, the intonation of the voice. As a therapist, you know the state of your client by the way they speak.
Yes.
And often, for females, it will be a higher pitched, very narrow range. So it sounds a little on the squeaky side or tight.
Yes.
But for males, it's going to go low and loud, and it's like barking.
Yeah.
And so in our bodies, when we hear low frequency sounds like barks, that we're wired to perceive that, or I call it the word neuroception because our nervous system detects it. It's on our cognition. When they're low frequency monotone barking, it's predator sound. And that's what fathers do when they get angry at their children.
And mothers. My daughter calls it the voice. And she's an adult now, and she has her own children, and so she's taught me a lot. She's like, Mom, you're doing that voice thing. I'm like, oh, okay. And then I know to relax a little, and it's because I'm anxious usually is what's creating.
Well, your voice thing is probably just a narrow range, not that squeaky. But a lot of people get really high up and they just can't even do it. But if you move into this, in a sense, dominant voice where the voice doesn't move much.
Right. It's forward and pushing.
Right. I'm not upset. What's the matter with you?
Right. And then it makes the other person feel crazy.
Because their body's reacting to it.
Yeah.
And all they can say is their body is saying it's not a safe place to be in.
Right.
So I'm going to give you some metaphors to kind of like to deal with or play with. Okay. So if we think about team sports, people are mobilized, but they're talking to each other, they're making facial contact, and they're, in a sense, reassuring each other.
They pat each other?
Yes, yes. Now, because they're using voice and face and gentle touch as a cue to a mobilized body that is not aggressive. Yes. So if you watch certain kids play well and certain kids are not even incorporated into the group in group play because those children don't read the cues of others.
They don't get the jokes. They don't get the nuance. Yeah, like particularly autistic children.
Right, and even though they want to play, the other children's bodies know that playing with them is dangerous. They can get hurt because of. So we think of all this inclusion. We should really think about, can we get the biological, the physiological state of the child, even of the parent, to be in a state that can be interactive and playful.
You know, that's interesting because they talk a lot about how dads, and you talk about the heavy voice, you know, and of course dads have heavier voices, but there's a lot of research about how important it is that fathers wrestle with their children and that there's more of a sense of the children's well-being. And I wonder if that's because that's a way that the dad can be with the child in a way that is like play.
We have a running joke in my house. Okay. My wife is Sue Carter, who discovered the linkage between oxytocin and social behavior. So
she studied feeling good.
Yeah. So we would, when we lived in Chicago, we used to go for walks all the time. And Sundays and Saturdays, the fathers would be out with the kids. And it was the most let's say, non-interactive, not for everyone,
right.
but like the kids would be, the father would be, reading a paper or looking at his phone, and the kids would be running. It was like, you start worrying about what's going to happen because there was very little interaction.
Yes.
And this was very common, at least in north side of Chicago, on the weekend.
Yeah.
So it was kind of, it's almost humorous, because once you know what the child's body needs,
yes,
you see this as something that's not good, but it's part of the culture.
Yes.
And of course, I use other terms like personal narratives. The fathers will come up with their narrative, or the parents will, about why this is good for the child, which is the personal narrative of your client who says, yes, I'm safe. But what that person was really telling you was they were not very aware of their own bodily state.
Yes.
And what I always like to say is that our biological state, our body state, hijacks our mind. So if we're too tight, too defensive, then we'll be reactive.
So how do we get ourselves, or the parents we work with, into a state where they can relax and be appropriately playful?
Okay, so that is a marvelous question, because we are human beings, and we are sensitive to the cues, and we can't just say, I'm not going to let those cues bother me.
Right.
Right.
I'm afraid I'm going to get hit in the face, or whatever else.
Right. So we have to see it in a more planned and a more proactive way, and that is, if our child is overwhelmed, is the room quiet, or is the room, in a sense, producing some of the activity because it has lots of noises, especially low frequency sounds. So what we forget is that the world we live in is bombarding our nervous system with cues of danger and life threat. Seriously, because the low frequency sounds of some of the mechanicals, air conditioning, shift physiological state. And if we have higher frequency sounds, our nervous system says there's danger there, and we have to be hyper vigilant. So when we deal with children, there are two issues. The kid is either frightened and withdrawn, or the child is hyper vigilant and not engaging.
Right.
And these are based upon physiological states that are enablers of those behaviors for very important survival means. So if we remove some of those cues from the environment,
like getting into the car, all of the sound associated with so many of our routines and rituals, going into grocery stores with really bright lights and lots of noise and echo.
Shopping malls, the background music, the escalators, all these vibrations are being read by the body that this is not a safe place to be. So the body anybody, including the parent's body, has to feel safe enough to offer safety to the other, and not just reactive. So what I think is the most powerful one, cue of safety, is intonation of voice. And the secret for that comes from just watching any mother. And what I said before we went on was, mothers do this intuitively, and fathers do it intuitively with their dogs, but not with their children.
Because of culture prohibiting men from being able to be soft and open and vulnerable.
Right.
But they'll baby talk to their dog, and
or their girlfriend or their wife,
and scold their child. Right.
Right.
Oh, I know who you're talking to.
Right.
Yeah.
Because those are the hidden, and they're not that hidden, cues of safety. And if we give those cues in environments, then individuals calm down. I did a little experiment with my granddaughter, who's now 4 months old. We saw her when she was 3 months old, and my son and my daughter-in-law went away for an hour. This was something special, actually, an hour and a half. And we were watching the baby. And after about an hour, the baby got a little fussy. Okay, natural. So I have this auditory intervention that I had developed for autistic kids initially to deal with auditory hypersensitivities, and that triggered the shift in physiological state and more social engagement behaviors. So I decided I'd play it for her. She stopped crying. She stopped being fussy. That's great. She was just attentive and engaged to the sounds.
Oh, wow.
17 minutes. So actually, we're talking about doing a study with babies on that. So,
you know, it's interesting because when my granddaughter was a little one and she was very hard to put to sleep, she came into the world a little too soon, I think. And my daughter and I would trade off holding and rocking to help her sleep. And I found that there were certain songs that she wanted me to sing. And even to this day, she's 10, she has favorites. And they seem to be, they're very old songs from, you know, the millennials, right? And kind of have a little bit of the breath in the voice. So it's like, it's not really the deeps, it's
melodic.
Early, it is. It's early one morning. So it's that little, and it's so old-fashioned. It's so Mary Poppins, and she loves it.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the Disney songs from the movies have some of these same features.
Yes.
And of course, autistic children love these.
They'll watch them over and over and over again.
So the auditory intervention I developed extracted what I thought were the frequencies that were the calming ones.
I see.
And they basically produced a neural exercise over 5 one-hour sessions. So it was like a treadmill for the system.
Wow. So this can correct or help a child whose middle ear isn't turned on, who has more dysregulation.
Right. Now it's the middle ear muscles, but the middle ear muscles are regulated by the nerves that regulate the face as well, and the eustachian tubes.
Wow.
So we talk about children with ear infections and a variety, because if the eustachian tube isn't draining, they will also often not have neuroregulation in the upper part of the face. So eustachian tube is regulated by a cranial nerve called 5 or trigeminal. You know the sensory part when you go to the dentist. That's where they give you the shots.
I see. Yes. Mm-hmm.
But it controls one of the muscles of the middle ear, and the facial muscle controls the facial nerve controls the other. So when they listen, they now are cueing the body that you can now pull those muscles in, tighten up the eardrum, and all those low frequency sounds of predator can now bounce off.
Oh, wow.
And so
so there's a little love bubble. We call that in psychology, that feeling of you and me.
Right.
You and me, which is why we're all...
presence. It's presence.
Yes, and a connection, and it's safe.
It's safe, and it creates the opportunity for reciprocity, because that system also regulates laryngeal and pharyngeal muscles, so our voices become more melodic. So it creates this reciprocity.
And reciprocity, you mean, is the back and forth, the serve and return, the you and me coming back, really harmonizing with each other.
Right.
Way to say it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that creates the resilience that we all want. So I thought, actually thinking about this, I decided I would try to pull the essence out, squeeze the essence out of the music.
Yes,
and see what
the
would
tincture.
Happen. Right. if you just delivered that without any of the background bass or any of the real high stuff, just gave the melodic, like you were talking about your granddaughter.
Yes.
And I saw things happening, and it was very startling to me. And actually, I got to talk softly because my younger son is here, and he was one of my first subjects. And he was a gaze averter. He was a parallel play.
Meaning doesn't look at you. He wants to be in his own world. Yes.
And teachers used to yell at him because he wasn't engaging.
Right. They thought he wasn't participating intentionally.
You got it. So I decided I would see what he would do. He listened for 10 minutes. He came downstairs.
Transfixed.
He was transformed. He came down and did close face-to-face, perfect articulation. He was a different person, and we ran through the whole protocol.
Yes.
He had been gifted in math. He then decided he wasn't interested in science or math. He became a journalist.
He started using the right side of his brain.
And he's on
More
TV.
integrated.
He's on TV a lot. He's a very engaging, very interesting.
Yes.
Very, I just
Which
smile.
really, that touches me, because I think we often, particularly if we're alarmed, we think of our children, we're afraid of them. We're afraid of who they will become. We're afraid they won't be the people we want. And what you're saying is, when your son felt safe, you could see this whole other part of him. You didn't have to yell or spank or punish or put in timeout or impinge on him.
Anything.
You had to actually...
He was a good kid.
I think all children are at a deep level if they're regulated.
But the point was to realize he was a good child, and he wanted to interact, and his body was in another state.
Yes.
And we shifted.
That he can't control, really.
He shifted his body, and he became someone different.
Yeah.
So this is and he's in his mid-30s now. So, but
we see some of these things when we send children to like occupational therapy, and it begins to work their brains left and right and bottom up in different ways, and they have significant changes in their ability to regulate emotionally and communicate. And it's amazing.
It's because the feedback loops are bidirectional, and we're in a culture that thinks so highly of the cortex and how that is where we need to develop language, metaphors, certain things, but not the whole regulation of our body. And that becomes the real issue. And we forget that for a person to be a contributing person to a group, they have to be a nice person.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. One of the things Dr. Tina Payne Bryson, who wrote with Dan Siegel the book called The Whole Brain Child, and she talks about your work. She talks about how we're way too cognitive, and we are always coming up with logical consequences and intervening with logic. And a part of my own work with children is actually very nonverbal. It's about finding my breath and matching theirs and being sweet on them, really. And your work is really showing us how maybe the language and the speaking is flooding children, or...
Well, so when a person talks, in a way, they are doing a yoga exercise. Because during exhalation is when our newer mammalian vagus calms us down. And we all attempt to calm down by talking, if we think about this. So the expression of being able to exhale slowly, we could sing or play a wind instrument, but talking is the thing that is most accessible to us. And one way from a parental or even a therapeutic one is not to force the child or the client into a listening mode, but allow them to talk.
Don't say, listen to me when I'm talking to you. That's what my mama used to say.
Look at me. Right. But as they, I'll give you a story of a friend who is a clinical psychologist, and she had to introduce me at a meeting. And she was very, very anxious about doing that because it'd be about 1,000 people. And she was very scared. She came up to me the night before at a party for the meeting, and she said she was really frightened. I said, don't worry, I'll fix it. And, so about 10 minutes to 9, the next morning, she comes up to me and she says, okay, Steve, fix
it. She's ready for you to fix it.
Yeah, she's very gullible. We know that part.
That's perfect.
Okay, so what I noticed, this is really, really on the fly. I noticed that she was gasping on breathing every other word or so. And I said, extend the duration of your phrases. She had great difficulty initially, and then she got the breath of speaking longer phrases, and that started to calm her down. She then did a beautiful introduction, and now she uses this breathing, talking, to treat anxiety.
So when you take voice lessons, and if you're a singer, you know that a lot of it is about bringing in the breath in the body and then exhaling slowly as long as you can. And I wonder if, like, when parents are lecturing, which is like it's how I was raised, it's what I did.
Yeah.
You know, that the lecturing that I'm doing is really to help me feel better as the parent, because I need to talk to get
That's
regulated.
right. That's right. And if the parents even extended the phrasing, they would start calming down. But they
Yes,
start to
like
huff
a
and
shorter
puff
lecture.
because they are feeling that the child's not listening.
Mm,
And if the child's not listening, they have to repeat it because they're going
yes.
through frustration.
And
So,
the child's probably not listening because they're aroused and they're not engaged the way you're talking about
yeah.
with the eyes and the ears
Yeah.
and all of that.
So, but it's double-edged, and I have actually another example. I got an email a few weeks ago from a mother who had used this auditory intervention program that I had developed,
Yes.
and her kid went through it and had done really well. So she brought the child back to the therapist 6 months later, and the child was going through the 5 1 hours. At the end of the fifth hour, the mother comes in, and the child goes into a tantrum. And but then she said, I realized what happened. She had been talking to another therapist and she kind of dissociated. So now she walked into the room with her son. The son's nervous system is primed to engage.
He's open.
He's open and he's engaging. And the
Mm.
mother is this
Still face.
still face, dissociative.
Yeah.
So it's physiologically frightening.
So our phone use is probably evoking some of that as well. Like when I'm reading,
Oh,
I'm not really you know what I mean? I'm not
right,
using my facial expressions.
right. We don't do certain things like we evolved to do. We evolved to be face to face, to use voice, to use gesture, to get
Yeah.
into sync. But the example of the child with his mother is that we think about the child as our target of intervention.
Mm.
And we deal sometimes very well with the child, but where do we put the child? Back in the
Right.
context.
Right. It's a relationship.
Right. So when I was doing my work on this in my laboratory, I got very frustrated because I said, you can fix it, but you can't maintain it because the real issues are psychoeducational or contextual. You
Yes.
need to develop a therapeutic model that includes the family.
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting because actually how I work is the traditional model. Sometimes people will send a child to me that I'm going to be with the child, but really what happens is I ask the parent to come in and I actually spend most of the time with the parent,
Yeah.
helping them feel
Yeah.
good, helping them feel regulated, helping them talk about what activates them.
Yeah.
And even when the child's there, I've come to be less interested in teaching the parent how to play. I have found that the parents actually just find it very soothing to watch me play with their children. And I suspect that the mirroring neurons are being activated, and that's a form of practice for them to then eventually adopt those kinds of experiences when I'm not there.
See, I would even make it simpler.
Yes, I'm always open to simple.
The simple is that as the parent is watching the child relax and play and enjoy, what
Yes.
happens to the parent's physiological state?
Well, I had a mother say, because I taught her your language, she goes, I'm in ventral, or the safety circuit. She said, I had a mother one time say to me, I'm so afraid of my daughter because when we play, she gets really excited and then loses her cool sometimes, and it makes the mother very anxious. She says, this is the first time I've experienced play where I could enjoy it because I didn't feel like I had to do anything that would make me anxious.
But as the mother gets into that enjoyment, she becomes a signal to the child. The child then doesn't have to display. In a sense, that relaxed face, that engagement is telling the child's nervous system that the child is part of the mother in that interaction.
Oh, wow. That's really helpful. I wanted to ask you a few things for parents because a lot of the parents I see have really hard lives. They're either really challenging jobs or they have children that have special needs, whether they might be traumatized or autistic or they're adopted or whatever, or they have sensory problems. So the daily load on the system of the parent is really harsh. And I've recommended some parents to do yoga because, of course, the breathing. And I'm wondering what you think about my latest interest is this idea of ballet bar 3. I don't know if you've heard of this, but the women go and do this, and they're little teeny movements, muscular movements, but it's mostly working the core. So you work the core, and what I'm finding, for me also personally, is that it seems to pop me out of this feeling of being fatigued through dissociative kinds of responses to stress. And I'm wondering if, if that might be helping the stress system and other things that you might think about for parents.
So what we want to do is not talk, when you talk about the stress system, people are normally talking about adrenals and sympathetic nervous system. They're talking about the norepinephrine, they're talking about cortisol coming from the adrenals, and talking about the sympathetic nervous system. What you want to think about also, because you brought it up, is when you start talking about below the diaphragm, and you start talking about all the symptomatology and all the feedback that goes on there that's linked to trauma, including the feedback that leads to mental dissociation and the physical manifestations of digestive problems, irritable bowel, fibromyalgia also, and basically autonomic dysfunction. But the primary thing is from below the diaphragm. When you start talking about pelvic floor and core and balance, you are giving different feedback from those systems up to the brainstem and telling the brainstem it's going well. And that feedback down gives you you're in a different physiological state, so you feel more energetic, but it's even doing more than that. It's not just a loop that ends in the brainstem. The loop then radiates upward and changes accessibility to different cortical areas. So we see the world more optimistically.
Oh, absolutely.
And we can, function at a higher level. So our subdiaphragmatic organs, when they are giving the right cues up, we don't feel them. We don't feel them because
that's interesting. It's the absence of problems.
Right. Whenever you have a stomach ache, what's the feeling of a stomach that's not in a state of being in pain? Because when it's working well, it's just fine. And that way, with the other organs below the diaphragm, it's because it provides the feedback that enables the rest of our nervous system to say, don't worry about that, we're okay.
Yes. Yeah, we've seen it. I know Amy has also seen where children that have sensory processing issues, if they go and do more core work with the physical therapist, the child just is happier, just feels better.
And within areas like OT, some of that comes merely from balance, vestibular, because when you do balance, the quick way to get the pelvic floor is balance.
I'm wondering if we can, I was just becoming aware of time, and I don't want to short circuit what we're talking about here, but I also want to be aware of the parents that are here, and I'm wondering if we can talk about how, knowing what we've talked about so far, what we can do as parents to cultivate this sense of safety with us. Because I think about myself, like when I'm stressed, I could try to fake a soothing voice, but my kid will know, like in the end, she's going to be like, yeah, mom, you're stressed out. Quit trying to fake it. And she'll call me out because she's intuitive.
Well, let's play with a couple things. Well, first of all, we can actually practice with dogs.
Okay.
And dogs, we know voice works real well. But we also know getting on the floor works real well with the dog.
Okay.
So if you get on all four with the dog, what will your dog do?
Lick your face.
She will definitely try to lick my face. Yes.
Yeah, but the facial expression, the tail, and then you can play hide and seek, you move around, and the dog wants to get into a reciprocal game. You chase the dog, or the dog. Okay, we tend not to do that with our children. What I'm really saying, that there are 2 points here. One is voice. And the other one is our body posture and where we are. Remember, the child sees us as this giant. So we are physically intimidating to the child. And the child, if the parent, at least up to a certain age, if the parent gets angry, the child's injured. And So there's a point in where the child's body picks up this size differential,
Yeah.
this vulnerability. And, one of the issues, of course, has been who are the children who are really severely injured. Often are children who have difficulty regulating their behavior. Their parents can't deal with it and think
Right.
that discipline and punishment is the way of controlling it. So they have in their mindset that this is a voluntary learned behavior,
Right.
when it's not a learned behavior. So
That's huge, actually.
the part of
Yeah.
learning that we want to get is a respect for the child's physiological state. And if the child is acting out, we want to make sure the child's in a place where things aren't broken and the child's not hurt.
Yeah.
So we create a different type of environment for this to occur.
Right.
It's so important that it's not a learned behavior. These are instinctive, physiological
Triggers. They get triggered.
Yeah.
And if we can get the child into a state of calmness, a state of safety, the child will develop strategies to stay out of these devastating states.
Right.
So what I was saying is most children, virtually all, are basically good kids and
Right.
want to do the right thing. The part that happens is that we in our culture are chronically evaluative.
Yeah.
So a child who has a behavioral problem already is defensive about having that problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've now lowered the threshold for that child to become physically defensive.
Right.
Because we made the child less safe.
Right.
by the judgment itself.
Yeah.
Right.
So,
By simply labeling it as a good child or a bad child. And we're guilty of this as parents and teachers.
Or bad behaviors. Even the
Right.
schools do that.
Yeah.
They'll give a little bullseye, and if you're close to the good behavior, but if you're not, you're out here.
But that assumes, that is a model that this is all intentional.
Right.
And it's so disappointing to so many people, not just children, when they can't control it.
Right.
Yes. Including parents when we can't control yelling at our children, or we can't control smacking them or spanking them. So a lot of this movement that Amy and I are doing is trying to create compassion for parents and like, how do you get your own stress response into it, or your own physiological sense of safety?
So moving back to the yoga and the movement and really emphasizing the power of breath and why it works. So when we exhale slowly, that's when that newer mammalian myelinated vagus inhibits fight-flight behaviors.
Yeah.
So we may, in fact, people often say, take a deep breath. But what we really mean is exhale slowly.
Right.
Exhale slowly is what we're doing.
So go ahead, I'm sorry.
No,
so a parent is having a hard time and or a child is having a hard time, the parent starts to get up here. Then what we are encouraging parents to do is before you do anything, you got to focus on your own regulation, right? Take a deep breath and exhale slowly and don't do anything.
Exhale slowly.
And maybe stand on one foot. Activate balance.
I will tell you that's going to be age related, but
don't try this at home unless you have doctor's permission. No.
But always remember that we can trigger a vagal inhibition of our fight, flight, or reactivity through slow exhalations.
Okay.
So we keep that in mind. It may take a few minutes for some people, and for some people, 1 or 2 breaths might do it.
Okay.
But it will help bring them into that more physiologically calm state.
Okay. You know, sometimes I think too that, and yoga's not for everyone, but just any breath exercise, whether it's Tai Chi or yoga, it also creates a memory of well-being.
Yeah.
So if you're practicing it when you're not aroused, then when you are, you can come back into that memory more easily.
It becomes a resource. But I used to kind of say to people, you should play wind instruments. Because that forces you that. And then with children who are dysregulated, I said, well, play a recorder or a penny whistle. These will get the system going. And when I would ever say that, there would be people in the audience who were keyboard players, pianists, and then there were percussion group or string players, and they would get angry at me. Why would they get angry at me? Because they would say, it's not just the winds who exhale slowly. We all do it. So we phrase and blow out slowly because that's how we feel the music. But then I would clarify and say, but with a wind instrument, you have no choice.
You can't forget.
You can't forget. That's right.
So when we're looking at our children, other than just their behaviors or before they get escalated, are there things we can look for?
Yes. In the children, you look at their face and listen to their voices.
Okay.
And this is actually I'm going to give you a real brief story. I was in the psychiatry department at the University of Illinois in Chicago. When I first moved there, I decided to give a lecture to the resident psychiatrists on why it was important to look at people's faces. I thought it was a given, obvious. So one senior fellow comes in to the little class, there's like 6 or 8 of these fellows. And he comes in and he looks at me and says, why am I even in the room? I was told that looking at faces wasn't important. So, but he stayed, and I said, keep talking. I said, what were you told to do? He says, we were told to turn sideways like this, take a clipboard, look at it and roll our eyes upward, and then the client would think that we were thinking of them. So I said, please continue talking. And I turned and did this, and he couldn't get a word out. Because when I turned away, it was so disruptive to his nervous system's expectation. Yeah. He still keeps in contact with me, and it's 15 years ago or 16 years ago. He sends me stuff because it was the most important class he had. But I was giving him the example of when your nervous system expects something and you violate it, what happens? And this is important about parents, because when a child turns away, the parent may get angry, get mobilized, yes. And that may be the trigger to the parent to do something. And that we can educate, because we can say to the parent, when the child disengaged without permission, yes. Or the spouse disengaged without permission, yeah. it triggered something in the person's body, and that got them mobilized. Yeah. And it's not anything the person said or did other than this disruption. And this
it's so subtle, right? If you're not aware, it feels so subtle.
Yes. It's awful. Don't do it anymore.
It is, but you think about like how often do we turn to go fold laundry or to look at
the better one is
or to look at the phone.
Keep talking. You can see the phone, right? Keep talking.
Yeah.
Take it.
No. Yeah.
And this is the world we're in. Mm-hmm. And we said it doesn't matter. The only thing important is what I said, not how I said. And what I'm really arguing has very little to do with what I'm saying. It's how I say it.
Yeah. Right.
And that's what the parent need to understand. The child's not listening to the content of the words. The child's like your pet, listening to the intonation of your voice and making meaning out of that.
Yes. So we practice with our dogs and we get down on the ground.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we practice our voice.
Mm-hmm. It's hard for men, though, in a way, because if you're conditioned that you're loved and accepted and validated in the culture and you belong, which is what we all need at a fundamental survival level, by setting boundaries, by being logical, by being firm, then for a father to baby talk with his child, or for him to get down on all fours, or for him to do all of these things, that's a big step.
Well, we have to say this is part of being a human. We have to change the rules.
Yes.
Yeah,
and we probably also have to ask, when did the rules come in that we couldn't do this?
Right.
You know,
probably age 3, I think, is when we.
Or let's say maybe in the 1950s with television. You know, so in a sense, we have a pop culture strategy of how to treat children. We don't know how old that was. We have a Dr. Spock kind of model, and that is don't spoil the child. And there was stuff before him even about if the child's crying, put the child away, as opposed to understanding the types of cries. And there are cries of hunger, there are cries of frustration. These are communication of the child.
And for little boys, we really, we're much harsher with them. Very early, we tell little boys not to cry, where we spank them more, we yell at them more. The research shows that we
Yeah.
hit them earlier,
Yeah.
to man them up, to, so there's a lot of anxiety around letting little boys cry and letting them have feeling. And I think as fathers, that probably on a neuroreceptive level, I'm not sure if I'm using the word correctly, but the body might get a little afraid to be vulnerable.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we didn't define neuroreception is our nervous system's ability to evaluate risk in the environment without awareness. So it's all occurring in background. What's making us feel safe. That's why these cues of like turning the head is a perfect example of neuroreception. Our body goes into a different state.
Yeah.
But our body goes into a different state when people use the voice.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I love one of the things about your work that I really stuck with me is this idea that it's not just about the absence of danger, that we're not just trying to have the absence of danger. So you used in a video the metaphor of being in a bomb shelter, and you're safe from danger, but your body's not going to be relaxed. Right. That you're looking for cues of safety, actually.
We're all in that world now because the world is so focused. The geopolitics of the world is about the removal of threat without the insertion of safety.
Yes.
So, and that changes culture, because to be connected, to be benevolent, to be generous, to be reciprocal, bodies have to feel safe. And we have a lot of work to do on that level.
Yes, we do. I was, a perfect example is I was watching people after I went through the TSA process. A gentleman in front of me, an African-American man in the South, was taking toothpicks out of his pockets because he was even afraid that would send the little sensor off, and it just broke my heart. But I watched how people stiffened in the line and became compliant and didn't want to disobey or be harmed. And then by the time you get to the gate where you're sitting there, everyone's just on their phones trying to, but there's this sense of like, and I wondered why flying for me is so unpleasant now in a way that it never used to be. Well, and I think it's just the activation of the system of
there's more, and that is the physical context of the plane is not like it was when we started to fly. So like middle seats were usually left open. Now we're like this. And the size of people has changed.
Yeah.
And that's another set of issues. So there's a linkage between ACEs and obesity.
Yeah.
And this is
and people may not know what ACEs are, but that's the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, early adversity.
Yeah. Now, one of the explanations, this is Vincent Folletti, and he just was totally shocked by the trajectory of weight gain of certain people who had trauma histories. A way of understanding it from a neurophysiological level is that if you downregulate metabolism, which is this subdiaphragmatic unmyelinated vagus, you're just going to get heavier. So part of this linkage, and it's not a deterministic linkage, but there's a higher prevalence with traumatized individuals to be obese. It doesn't mean everyone that's been traumatized is obese, or everyone who's obese has been traumatized. But there's a shift in neural function, and part of that is metabolic.
So I know I sort of wandered off a little bit there, and it may not feel quite connected to all that we've been talking about, but I'll just say that it just tells me, and a lot of what we're doing is healing as a culture, because ACEs are really common. 2/3 of all people have an ACE, at least of one. So that the need to move, the need to do these breathing kinds of things like yoga and core work, but also to create cues of safety in our environment for ourselves, to be more gentle to ourselves, and to create that for our children will help those systems come online and give us resilience and
give us the smile.
And give us the smile
Yeah.
and the joy. Yeah, because I always feel like parenting should feel better. We should be able to enjoy it more.
Absolutely. I mean, as my children got older, and I didn't have the role of a daddy.
Yes.
I just had a glowing smile. It was just totally. It was transforming. I didn't have to deal with that. I want to go back to one other point, and that is, we are a traumatized species. This is something else that I frequently say. I said that, we live in a world that believes that the removal of threat is sufficient without thinking about the insertion of features of safety. But we also are a traumatized species. It doesn't make us less for being traumatized. It just triggers a whole set of adaptive adjustments. In a way, we learn more about what it is to be human by understanding what trauma does. And we know that there are two things that trauma does, and becomes very important to families, two major things. One, of course, it triggers the defensiveness, and you see people less socially engaged, and it challenges relationships.
Yes.
You have to be safe and immobilized without fear to be in a loving relationship. But the other thing is, it seems to shoot an arrow directly at a part of our nervous system that gives us the purpose to live, why we want to live. And that, to me, is so important. And actually, if you were to ask me, what is it that I'm going to be looking at next? I'm going to be looking at trying to understand the neurophysiology of purpose to live.
Oh, wow.
Because that is, so when you work with trauma, that's what you really see.
Yes.
And one thing that we also haven't discussed, and that is parenting a child who has a trauma history, is a difficult task for a parent, and it's traumatizing to them as well.
Yes.
But trauma is not always physical abuse by another person.
Right.
Trauma can occur through prematurity, through medical procedures, through accidents, through effects like earthquakes and volcanoes, where people are really being consumed with terror, their body. And then when we start looking at the people in the rest of the world who are being subjugated to horrible things in terms of chronic warfare, Holocaust type behaviors, these are, you just, all you can do is feel in your heart and say, what brave people to survive.
What truly brave people.
Heroic.
Yeah, and it's such a beautiful message, because so many of the parents that follow our work are like myself. We have high ACE scores, and parenting was more painful and much harder, but it's so beautiful when you start to see that a lot of the adaptive problems really did save our life. And so it's just a harder road. It's a harder road.
The first thing, and you're hitting it right on it, is to see your reactions to the trauma, not as being a victim, not just being a survivor, but being heroic in surviving. So it's a type of empowerment that changes the personal narrative. And as that personal narrative changes, we become stronger.
Because there's greater acceptance for what we are.
Yeah, well, greater self-acceptance.
Yes.
And that's really what it's all about, the sense of who we are to ourselves. And this is even with parents dealing with their children. How they present themselves to their child is the trigger to the child, to calm them or to keep them wrapped up and mobilized.
Right.
Well, thank you so very, very much. This has been such a rich conversation. I'm just, it's been wonderful. Is there anything, Amy, anyone needs something answered before we end? Or
no, we had just a lot of lovely comments as y'all were talking about, how they could relate to what you were talking about, how it shows up with their children, how they like different songs that just will help them fall right to sleep, or that shing sound as they are gentle with their babies. And then lastly, someone just said, thank you so much, such wonderful information. So,
well, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I love your work, and thank you so much for everything you were doing for the field of trauma, for parents. It's just been such an honor to be with you today, Steve. So
Well,
thank you
thank
very
you.
much.
And thank you, and continue what you're doing. It's wonderful. And it's a pleasure to contribute to this goal. Thank you.
Thank you.